In the frozen hell of December 1944, as German panzers tore through the Ardennes forest in what would become known as the Battle of the Bulge, the Allied command faced a crisis that threatened to unravel everything they had fought for since D-Day. Hitler had gambled everything on one final, desperate offensive, a massive surprise attack designed to split the Allied forces, capture the vital port of Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace in the West. The Wehrmacht struck with overwhelming force, exploiting fog and forest to mask their advance, catching American units completely off guard. Entire divisions were encircled, communication lines collapsed, panic rippled through command posts as the realization set in. This wasn't a localized skirmish. This was an existential threat. Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower convened an emergency meeting at Verdun on December 19, 1944. The atmosphere in that room was suffocating. Generals who had spent months planning methodical advances now stared at maps showing German penetration 30 miles deep into Allied territory. The situation demanded immediate action, but the scale of what was required seemed impossible. To relieve the besieged 101st Airborne Division trapped in Bastogne, the critical road junction that had become the linchpin of the entire battle, someone would need to disengage from their current positions, wheel 90 degrees north, and drive through winter storms and enemy resistance to break the siege. The distance? Approximately 100 miles. The timeline? Days, not weeks. Most commanders in that room understood the logistical nightmare this represented. Winter conditions had turned roads into ice sheets, supply lines were stretched to breaking, units were exhausted from continuous combat. Most commanders understood this, but George S. Patton, Jr. was not most commanders. When Eisenhower posed the question to the assembled generals, how quickly could they pivot their forces northward to strike the German flank and relieve Bastogne, there was hesitation. Calculations began. Logistics officers mentally tallied fuel requirements, ammunition stocks, the time needed to issue new orders down through corps, divisions, regiments. The consensus hovered around a week, perhaps 10 days if they pushed hard. It was the reasonable answer, the professional answer, the answer that accounted for the friction of war, the Murphy's Law calculations that every military planner builds into their estimates. Then Patton spoke. 48 hours, he said. Not as a boast, not as bravado, as a statement of operational fact. The room fell silent. Some thought he was joking. Others assumed he'd misunderstood the question. To move an entire corps, 3 full divisions comprising roughly 133,000 men, along with tanks, artillery, supply vehicles, and all the mechanized apparatus of modern warfare, 90 degrees from their current axis of advance, across icy roads, through enemy territory, and into the teeth of a German offensive, all within 2 days, it defied every principle of military planning. It was, by any conventional standard, impossible. But Patton had already done the impossible calculation. While other commanders were still absorbing the scale of the German offensive, Patton's mind was racing through the operational mathematics that would define one of the most audacious maneuvers in military history. He understood something fundamental that separated him from his peers. Speed itself was a weapon. Not reckless haste, but the kind of velocity that collapses enemy decision cycles, that arrives before defensive preparations can solidify, that transforms strategic desperation into tactical opportunity. What Eisenhower and the other commanders didn't yet know was that Patton had already anticipated this scenario. Days before the Verdun conference, as fragmentary reports of the German offensive began filtering through intelligence channels, Patton had ordered his staff to prepare contingency plans for exactly this kind of pivot. 3 separate plans, coded with biblical references, and he had selected the one he believed most viable before he even entered that conference room. While others were still processing the shock of the German breakthrough, Patton was already mentally executing the maneuver. This wasn't confidence. This was something deeper, something that touched on the psychology of a commander who had spent his entire life preparing for moments precisely like this. Patton understood war not as a chess game of careful moves and countermoves, but as organized violence, where tempo and aggression could override numerical disadvantage. He had studied Napoleon's campaigns obsessively, internalizing the lessons of Austerlitz and Jena, where rapid maneuver had shattered larger forces. He had dissected the German blitzkrieg tactics that had devastated Poland and France, recognizing that speed generated its own form of combat power, a psychological weapon that paralyzed enemy response. But beyond tactics and historical study, there was something else driving Patton, a pathological need to prove his worth in a command structure that had consistently underestimated and sidelined him. His relationship with Eisenhower was complex, fraught with the tension between the political general and the warrior general. Eisenhower represented coalition warfare, diplomatic necessity, the careful balancing of Allied politics and military objectives. Patton represented pure, distilled aggression, the application of violence as the primary problem-solving mechanism. Eisenhower had already relieved Patton once, after the infamous slapping incidents in Sicily, where Patton had struck soldiers suffering from combat fatigue, calling them cowards. Patton had been humiliated, temporarily shelved, used as a decoy in the elaborate deception plans preceding D-Day. Now, in this frozen conference room in Verdun, Patton saw his redemption. Not just an opportunity to relieve Bastogne, but a chance to demonstrate that his way of war, fast, brutal, relentless, was not just valid, but essential. When Eisenhower pressed him on the 48-hour timeline, asking if he was serious, Patton didn't waver. He laid out the basics. His Third Army would disengage, wheel north, and smash into the German flank. He would command this personally. He would not stop. He would not slow down. He would move, and the Germans would break, or they would try to stop him. What happened next would become the stuff of military legend, a maneuver so audacious that even decades later, military historians would struggle to fully explain how it succeeded. The moment Patton left the Verdun conference, the machinery of the Third Army began moving with a precision that bordered on the supernatural. What appeared to outside observers as spontaneous genius was in reality the product of meticulous preparation and an organizational culture that Patton had forged through months of relentless drilling. His staff officers had already wargamed this exact scenario. Radio operators had pre-positioned themselves. Logistics officers had calculated fuel requirements down to the gallon. Unit commanders had received preliminary warning orders even before the conference concluded. This wasn't improvisation. This was a conductor raising his baton to an orchestra that had already memorized the score. But the scale of what Patton was attempting cannot be overstated. Modern military operations are extraordinarily complex systems, and changing the axis of advance for an entire Army Corps represents one of the most difficult maneuvers in warfare. Consider the mechanics. Each division within Patton's Third Army Corps consisted of approximately 15,000 men, hundreds of tanks and armored vehicles, artillery batteries, supply trucks, ambulances, communication equipment, and mobile command posts. These units were currently engaged in active combat operations against German forces in the Saar region. They couldn't simply stop fighting, turn around, and drive north. They had to disengage from contact with the enemy, one of the most dangerous phases of any military operation, reorganize into movement formations, establish new supply routes, coordinate with air support assets, and maintain operational security so the Germans wouldn't detect the maneuver and exploit the temporary vulnerability. The roads themselves presented a nightmare. The Ardennes winter of 1944 was among the harshest in decades. Temperatures plunged below zero. Ice coated every surface. The narrow roads that snaked through the dense forests could barely accommodate two-way traffic under normal conditions. Now they would need to handle 3 entire divisions moving in the same direction simultaneously, while supply convoys moved in the opposite direction to establish forward dumps of fuel and ammunition. Traffic control points had to be established every few miles. Military police had to orchestrate a ballet of steel and rubber, where a single broken-down vehicle could create cascading delays that would ripple through the entire column. And they had to do all of this while maintaining combat readiness. This wasn't a peacetime road march. German aircraft, despite Allied air superiority, still conducted sporadic attacks. German reconnaissance units probed Allied movements constantly. The roads passed through or near contested territory where small enemy units could ambush supply convoys or strike at command posts. Every mile traveled increased vulnerability. Every hour of movement was an hour when units couldn't effectively defend themselves or respond to enemy contact. Patton understood these risks intimately. What separated him from other commanders wasn't a disregard for danger. It was a calculation that speed itself mitigated risk. A moving army was harder to target than a static one. Momentum generated its own protective force. The Germans wouldn't expect such a rapid maneuver because conventional military doctrine said it couldn't be done. That expectation gap was a weapon Patton intended to exploit ruthlessly. His method of command during this period reveals the psychology of a leader who operated on principles that defied traditional military hierarchy. Patton didn't manage through written orders and careful staff coordination. He led through personal presence and calculated fury. He drove to the front constantly, appearing at crossroads and command posts with a speed that seemed impossible.
soldiers would look up to see his jeep racing past, Patton standing in it despite the cold, ivory-handled revolvers visible on his hips, a carefully cultivated image of aggressive command. He berated officers who showed any hesitation, fired commanders who failed to maintain the pace, and publicly praised those who exceeded expectations. His presence was electric and terrifying in equal measure. But beneath the theatrical exterior was a commander who understood the psychological dimension of warfare with frightening clarity. Patton knew that armies don't fail because of logistics or firepower deficiencies. They fail when morale collapses, when exhaustion overwhelms discipline, when soldiers begin to question whether the objective is worth the sacrifice. He had to keep his men believing not just in the mission, but in their own invincibility. Every speech, every public appearance, every profane tirade was calculated to maintain that psychological edge. He was selling them a narrative that they were part of something historic, that their suffering had meaning, that their commander would never ask them to do anything he wasn't willing to do himself. The movement began on December 20th, 1944, barely 12 hours after the Verdun Conference concluded. The 4th Armored Division, 26th Infantry Division, and 80th Infantry Division began their pivot northward. Traffic control points lit up with activity as convoys began funneling onto the designated routes. Radio nets crackled with position reports and coordination messages. In forward positions, soldiers who had been dug in for days suddenly received orders to pack up, mount vehicles, and move. The confusion was manageable only because Patton's staff had drilled these procedures repeatedly. Company commanders knew their routes, supply officers knew their distribution points. Even the chaos had been choreographed. Within the first 12 hours, Patton's forces had covered nearly 30 miles, an impressive pace under any circumstances, but particularly remarkable given the conditions and the complexity of the maneuver. Wehrmacht intelligence officers monitoring Allied radio traffic began picking up fragments of unusual movement patterns, but the speed confused their analysis. Standard doctrine suggested that any major redeployment would take days to organize. These intercepts suggested something was already underway. German commanders dismissed the reports as misinterpretation or deception efforts. The Allies couldn't possibly be moving that quickly. This was Patton's masterstroke, moving so fast that enemy intelligence couldn't process what was happening until it was too late to respond effectively. By the time German commanders realized that an entire corps was bearing down on their south flank, Patton's lead elements were already engaging their screening forces. The tempo itself became a form of firepower, collapsing the German decision cycle, forcing them into reactive mode rather than deliberate planning. Eisenhower, monitoring reports from his headquarters, found himself repeatedly checking the position updates. The numbers seemed impossible. Patton wasn't just meeting his 48-hour timeline, he was exceeding it. By the evening of December 21st, barely 36 hours into the maneuver, Patton's lead units had covered nearly 70 miles and were already in contact with German forces defending the approaches to Bastogne. Staff officers at Supreme Headquarters Allied Expedition Force plotted the positions on their maps and double-checked the reports. The scale of what Patton had accomplished defied their models of what was operationally possible. It was then, staring at those maps, that Eisenhower reported uttered the words that would define this moment in military history. Good God, he's already there. Not quite 100 miles in 48 hours, but close enough that the distinction was meaningless. Patton had done what no one else believed possible. He had turned the entire Third Army 90 degrees, moved it across 100 miles of frozen terrain, and arrived at the battlefield while the Germans were still trying to understand what was happening. But arriving at Bastogne was only the beginning. Now came the harder part, breaking through the German encirclement and relieving the paratroopers who had been fighting surrounded for days.
The approach to Bastogne revealed the true cost of Patton's velocity. Speed had gotten his forces into position, but now they faced the grinding reality of breaking a reinforced German defensive line. The Wehrmacht units encircling Bastogne weren't the demoralized, retreating forces that Allied armies had been pursuing since Normandy. These were frontline combat divisions, many transferred from the Eastern Front, veterans of Stalingrad and Kursk who understood defensive warfare with brutal efficiency. They had transformed the approaches to Bastogne into killing zones, minefields overlapping with pre-sighted artillery coordinates, machine gun positions interlocking to create crossfire lanes, anti-tank guns positioned into filadar where they could strike American armor at optimal angles. Patton's 4th Armored Division, spearheading the relief effort, slammed into these defenses on December 22nd. What followed was not the lightning breakthrough that the rapid march had suggested, but instead a series of savage close-quarters engagements where American tanks and infantry had to fight for every yard. The terrain favored the defenders. Dense forests channeled American advances into predictable corridors. German commanders had placed obstacles precisely where they would cause maximum delay. Felled trees blocking roads, bridges demolished, stream crossings mined. Each obstacle forced American engineers to the front under fire, slowing the momentum that had carried them this far. The weather, which had provided concealment during the approach march, now turned even more hostile. Fog settled over the battlefield so thick that visibility dropped to mere yards. American air superiority, which had been a decisive advantage throughout the campaign in Europe, became irrelevant. The famed P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs that could shred German formations sat grounded on muddy airfields, pilots staring at skies they couldn't penetrate. This was infantry and armor warfare in its most primitive form, men and machines colliding in close terrain where technology mattered less than courage and the willingness to close with the enemy. Patton pushed harder. His orders to subordinate commanders were unambiguous: maintain pressure, accept casualties, do not stop. He relieved a regimental commander on the spot for pausing to consolidate after taking a position, replacing him with an officer who would maintain the attack tempo. To critics who argued this was wasteful of lives, Patton's response reflected his philosophy of war. More men would die if they allowed the Germans time to strengthen defenses than if they pressed the attack continuously. Speed saved lives by shortening the overall duration of combat. Hesitation merely prolonged the killing. This calculation wasn't abstract theorizing. It was grounded in Patton's understanding of how modern mechanized warfare functioned. The German defenders around Bastogne had finite resources. Their ammunition was limited. Their fuel was critically low. Their supply lines, stretched across the Ardennes breakthrough, were under constant harassment from American artillery and what airstrikes could penetrate the weather. Every hour the Americans maintained pressure was an hour the Germans couldn't rest, couldn't resupply, couldn't rotate exhausted units out of the line. Continuous offensive action exploited those vulnerabilities, grinding down German combat effectiveness faster than deliberate, methodical attacks. But this approach demanded something extraordinary from the American soldiers executing it. They had already endured the exhausting march north, sleeping in vehicles when they slept at all, eating cold rations on the move, fighting off the numbing cold that made every task harder. Now they were being thrown into continuous combat with minimal rest, expected to maintain offensive operations against an entrenched enemy in the worst possible conditions. Lesser units would have fractured under this pressure. Patton's Third Army held together because he had spent months forging a culture where the unthinkable became routine. Inside Bastogne, the besieged 101st Airborne Division and attached units were reaching their breaking point. They had been encircled since December 20th, cut off from supply, outnumbered, facing repeated German attacks from multiple directions. Their acting commander, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, had famously responded nuts to a German surrender ultimatum, but bravado couldn't replace ammunition or medical supplies. Casualties were mounting. The aid stations overflowed with wounded men who couldn't be evacuated. Artillery ammunition was rationed to the point where batteries can fire only in the most critical situations. The perimeter was contracting as German pressure intensified. The paratroopers in Bastogne could hear the sounds of Patton's advance, the rumble of artillery, the distinctive crack of American tank guns. Hope and desperation mingled in equal measure. They knew relief was coming, but whether it would arrive before their defenses collapsed was the only question that mattered. German commanders, recognizing the same calculus, threw everything available at Bastogne's perimeter, attempting to crush the defenders before American reinforcements could break through. The final days of the siege became a race between German desperation and American speed. On December 26, 1944, elements of the 4th Armored Division's 37th Tank Battalion finally broke through the German lines south of Bastogne. The breakthrough wasn't clean or dramatic. It was a grinding, brutal fight through the final defensive positions, tanks and infantry pushing forward yard by bloody yard. But when Lieutenant Charles Bogus's lead tank reached the outskirts of Bastogne and made contact with the 101st Airborne's defensive positions, the siege was broken. Patton had delivered on his promise. Not quite 48 hours from conference to relief, the actual timeline was closer to 6 days of continuous combat operations. But the operational miracle was in the maneuver itself, not the final battle to break the encirclement. Eisenhower's reaction to Patton's success was complex. Publicly, he praised the achievement, recognizing it as a crucial turning point in the Battle of the Bulge. The rapid redeployment and relief of Bastogne had prevented the German offensive from achieving its objectives, stabilizing the Allied front at its most critical moment. But privately, Eisenhower remained ambivalent about Patton's methods. The casualties taken in the drive to Bastogne were significant, thousands of American soldiers killed or wounded in less than a week of combat. Eisenhower, who bore ultimate responsibility for every Allied death, questioned whether a more methodical approach might have achieved the same objective with fewer losses. This tension captured the fundamental difference between the two commanders. Eisenhower thought strategically, balancing multiple theaters, managing coalition politics, calculating acceptable loss rates against long-term objectives. Patton thought operationally and tactically, focused on the immediate problem of destroying enemy forces and seizing objectives. To Patton, casualties were tragic but inevitable. The cost of war that couldn't be eliminated, only managed through aggressive action that shortened the overall conflict.
To Eisenhower, every death required justification against the broader strategic picture, consideration of public opinion, and assessment of whether the objective warranted the sacrifice. Neither perspective was wrong. War demands both the strategic vision that Eisenhower provided and the tactical ferocity that Patton embodied. The genius of the Allied command structure was that it contained both, even as the friction between them created constant tension. Eisenhower needed Patton's aggressive instincts to exploit opportunities that cautious commanders would miss. Patton needed Eisenhower's strategic guidance to channel his aggression towards objectives that mattered in the larger context of winning the war. What made Patton's Bastogne maneuver legendary wasn't just the operational achievement, it was what it revealed about the nature of military command in modern warfare. Speed, aggression, and calculated risk-taking could overcome seemingly impossible odds, but only when backed by meticulous planning, rigorous training, and a command culture that embraced audacity as doctrine rather than deviation.
The mythology that grew around Patton's relief of Bastogne would eventually overshadow the operational reality, transforming a complex military maneuver into a simplistic narrative of one man's genius overcoming impossible odds. But the truth was far more instructive and far more disturbing than the legend. What Patton accomplished wasn't magic. It was the application of a command philosophy so demanding, so psychologically brutal, that few commanders could sustain it, and even fewer organizations could survive it intact. In the months following Bastogne, as the Third Army continued its drive across Germany, the costs of Patton's methods became increasingly apparent. His divisions suffered casualty rates significantly higher than comparable units operating under more cautious commanders. This wasn't incompetence or recklessness in the traditional sense, it was the calculated price of maintaining offensive tempo. Patton's units attacked when other armies consolidated. They pushed through exhaustion when doctrine called for rest. They accepted tactical risks that other commanders deemed unacceptable. The result was a combat effectiveness that wavered between brilliant and catastrophic, sometimes within the same operation. Eisenhower watched this dynamic with growing concern. He recognized Patton's value as a breakthrough commander, the spearhead you unleashed when conventional approaches had failed. But he also understood that Patton's way of war was unsustainable as a long-term operational strategy. Armies are human organizations with human limitations. Push too hard for too long, and they break, not in dramatic collapses, but in gradual erosion of combat effectiveness, rising rates of combat fatigue, declining unit cohesion, increasing instances of soldiers simply refusing orders because their psychological reserves were completely exhausted. The tension came to a head repeatedly in the final months of the war. Patton chafed at every restraint Eisenhower imposed, interpreting caution as cowardice and strategic deliberation as weakness. When Eisenhower halted Patton's advance to allow other Allied armies to catch up and maintain a unified front, Patton viewed it as sabotage, a deliberate attempt to deny him the glory of being first into Berlin or first across the Rhine. His diary entries from this period reveal a commander consumed by resentment, convinced that political considerations were being prioritized over military effectiveness, that the war was being prolonged unnecessarily because lesser commanders couldn't match his tempo. But Eisenhower's perspective was grounded in a reality that Patton either couldn't or wouldn't acknowledge. Wars aren't won by individual commanders or even individual armies. They're won by coalitions maintaining sufficient cohesion to outlast their enemies. The politics Patton despised weren't peripheral to the war effort, they were central to it. Managing British sensitivities, coordinating with Free French forces, maintaining Soviet cooperation on the Eastern Front, preventing the alliance from fracturing under the pressure of competing national interests. These tasks were as militarily essential as any battlefield maneuver. Patton's singular focus on tactical victory blinded him to the strategic complexity that Eisenhower navigated daily. The relief of Bastogne became the template that defined both men's legacies. For Patton, it represented the vindication of his entire command philosophy, proof that aggressive action, speed, and personal leadership could accomplish what careful planning and methodical advance could not. He spent the remainder of his life, cut short by a traffic accident in December 1945, believing that the war would have ended months earlier if commanders like Eisenhower had been willing to unleash forces like his Third Army without restraint. For Eisenhower, Bastogne demonstrated something different, that exceptional commanders operating at the tactical and operational level could achieve remarkable results, but that winning wars required balancing those achievements against broader strategic imperatives. He never denied Patton's brilliance, but he also never apologized for restraining it when strategic considerations demanded. In Eisenhower's calculus, the relief of Bastogne succeeded not because Patton operated without constraint, but because his aggressive instincts were channeled toward an objective that aligned with Allied strategic priorities at a moment of genuine crisis. The historical debate continues decades later because both interpretations contain truth. Military historians dissecting the Bastogne operation can point to moments where Patton's methods produced results that no other commander could have achieved. They can also identify instances where his approach unnecessarily sacrificed soldiers to maintain a tempo that added marginal value to the overall operation.
The conclusion is uncomfortable. Patton's way of war worked precisely because it was rarely employed. If every Allied commander had operated like Patton, the coalition would have collapsed under the strain of unsustainable casualties and psychological exhaustion. But because Patton existed within a command structure that could direct his aggression toward critical objectives while restraining it elsewhere, his methods became a tool rather than a template. This reveals something essential about the nature of military genius that popular narratives consistently miss. Great commanders aren't great in isolation. They're great within specific contexts, facing specific problems, operating within organizational structures that can both enable and constrain their instincts. Patton, without Eisenhower, would have been a disaster, consuming his own army in a series of tactically brilliant but strategically meaningless offensives. Eisenhower, without Patton, would have won the war more slowly, with fewer dramatic moments, but perhaps with fewer unnecessary casualties. Together, they formed a command dynamic that could balance aggression with caution, speed with sustainability, tactical audacity with strategic coherence. The phrase, "good God, he's already there," endures because it captures a moment of genuine astonishment, the sudden realization that conventional limitations had been transcended through sheer force of will and organizational excellence. But context matters. Eisenhower's astonishment wasn't admiration without reservation. It was recognition that Patton had done something extraordinary, combined with the quiet calculation of what that achievement had cost and whether similar gambles should be attempted in the future. In the decades since, military organizations worldwide have studied Patton's Bastogne maneuver, attempting to extract lessons that can be systematized and taught. They've largely failed, because what Patton accomplished wasn't primarily a matter of technique or doctrine. It was the product of a specific personality operating within a specific organizational culture at a specific historical moment. You can teach the mechanics of rapid redeployment, the logistics of moving armies at speed, the communication protocols that enable complex maneuvers. You cannot teach the psychological intensity that Patton brought to command, the willingness to sacrifice everything, including his own soldiers, his own reputation, his own physical safety, in pursuit of victory. This is why Patton remains simultaneously celebrated and controversial. He achieved things that more balanced commanders could not, but the methods he employed were deliberately unsustainable, designed to generate maximum effect over short periods rather than maintain steady performance over extended campaigns. He was the human equivalent of a sprint in a marathon, devastating when deployed at the right moment, catastrophic if overused. The final lesson of Bastogne isn't about speed or aggression or even genius. It's about the relationship between commanders and the systems they operate within. Great organizations don't just tolerate exceptional individuals. They create structures that can harness their strengths while mitigating their weaknesses. The Allied command structure during World War II succeeded not because it produced perfect commanders, but because it could integrate radically different command styles into a coherent operational approach. Patton charged, Eisenhower balanced, Montgomery deliberated, Bradley coordinated. Each brought capabilities the others lacked, and the system worked because it could employ each commander where their strengths mattered most, while preventing their weaknesses from becoming catastrophic. When Eisenhower looked at those maps in December 1944 and realized that Patton had already reached Bastogne, he wasn't just witnessing a military achievement. He was seeing the validation of a command philosophy that embraced contradiction, that accepted commanders like Patton precisely because they operated outside normal constraints, but that also recognized the necessity of keeping such commanders pointed in directions where their exceptional capabilities served larger strategic purposes. "Good God, he's already there," wasn't just surprise. It was the complex acknowledgement that sometimes, perhaps rarely, the impossible becomes necessary, and the only way to achieve it is to unleash forces you can barely control and hope they deliver before they consume themselves. That's the uncomfortable truth at the heart of military genius. It's almost always destructive, even when it's effective. The art of high command is knowing when that destruction serves a purpose worth the cost.